already I'm going to have to make sure we have a caveat because the word sovereignty has all kinds of weird loading. And if people are listening to this and they feel like they think they know what that means, I apologize in advance because in some sense we're trying to just redefine it, but it's the closest word that we have to the thing we're trying to describe. So in an individual agent, a sentient agent's relationship to the world, there are three distinct functions. We can actually map it to four if we want, but I'm going to map it to three. Three distinct functions that describe the capacity of a sentient agent's ability to respond to the world. The first piece is the degree to which that sentient agent is able to perceive reality. So you might call that the perceptive modality. And so perception here includes everything from, say, like your senses, your ability to see. If I lack eyesight, I can't perceive electromagnetic radiation. If I lack olfaction, I can't perceive chemical molecules, right? If I lack hearing, I can't perceive sound waves. So the modality, and then also the bandwidth. So, for example, if I have vision but I can't perceive ultraviolet, I can't perceive ultraviolet. And similarly, if I have vision but I'm looking at the sun, I'll be overwhelmed. I'll have too much input to be able to process it. So the first portion of sovereignty is the total capacity to perceive reality. The second portion combines sense-making and choice-making, which is we might call meaning, your capacity to take perception and move that through into making good choices about what to do in the world. So if I'm like a camera and I can see in the sense that light can come in and it can be converted into something, but if there's nothing else, I'm just a camera, there's no sense-making, there's no meaning-making happening at all. And the degree to which I have the capacity to make meaning is in many ways the degree to which I have the potential to have agency. And there's lots of variables there. Again, there's questions of overwhelm. Like, for example, let's say I'm in a situation where somebody's coming at me physically with a large threat of violence. I'm perceiving it, but now I'm trying to make meaning out of it, which is to say, what do I do? How do I respond to this? If I get fight or flight, if my adrenal system kicks off and it actually kicks me into overwhelm, then I'm actually decreasing my capacity to make good choices because the fight or flight response shifts me into a very narrow band of action. Or maybe I just have bad heuristics. There's just, I'm perceiving some pattern in the world, but I don't know how to make sense of that pattern. So the signal is out there, but I just can't do anything with it. And then the third dimension is your capacity to actually make effective action in the world. So perhaps I have perceived the pattern. I see that carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere is generating feedback loops that are raising the amount of temperature and the acidification of the oceans, and I perceive that that's going to lead to catastrophic collapse of coral reefs. But I don't have any capacity to respond to it in terms of agency. The problem is just too complex, my effective action is too limited, or my ability, my power is too limited, or my ability to understand the consequences of my actions is too limited. The rate limiting on action has to do with the scope of the problem in relationship to your power, bang for the buck, which is to say the amount of energy that it takes for you to deliver on some degree of effectiveness, and unintended consequences, the degree to which what you're doing generates more change in the world than you're intending. So if I think about like a pond, I think many of us have run into the situation as a kid. There's like a very, very smooth pond, and I can see through it. It's perfectly clear, and I want to grab something at the bottom of the pond, but as I put my fingers into the water, it creates ripples and makes it impossible for me to see. So because I'm interfering with my own environment, my agency is preventing my ability to be effective. So that's consequences, my inability to relate to the world in a way to actually respond to the consequences of my own actions. So every discrete sentient agent is going to have an envelope that takes all three of these aspects into consideration, and we'll call that envelope sovereignty. And so the more sovereign you are, it's like a sphere, the more capacity you have to perceive, make meaning in, and respond to the reality that you're living in. And a failure in any one of these three modalities will tend to disrupt your sovereignty or limit it in your environment. And so what ends up happening is this thing that we're talking about, this new frame of mind, this new kind of collective intelligence, is extremely sensitive to the actual sovereignty of the individual agents that compose it. So then using this concept of sovereignty, imagine right now the three of us are attempting to enter into a form of communion, meaning we're trying to form a collective intelligence. And that collective intelligence is going to be bound by the sovereignty of each one of us. Meaning, for example, if the two of you have a private language, which you probably do, right? You're in deep relationship, you're aware of each other's facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. So there's a lot of things that are going to be happening at the level of perception that I might not be able to perceive. So you'll have a sense of what's happening that I won't have any access to because it's outside of the sphere of my sovereignty. But let's say, for example, I've done a lot of work and practice, and so I have a high degree of discernment around those kinds of things. I could just watch and listen. And even though I won't quite be able to make sense of it, I'll be able to build a vastly better sense of it than if I was on a lower level of discernment. But let's flip it around. Let's say, for example, that we're engaging in something, and I say something that triggers you emotionally, meaning that there's something that happens in the verbal domain, that a series of sounds that come out of my mouth, you hear and process, that simultaneously the way that you process things generates a response in your body, which is highly emotional, and that emotional response actually pushes you to the point where you've got an adrenal response and a cortisol response, which then reduces your sovereignty. Right? So now we've got two issues. One issue is the level of sovereignty that you had initially wasn't adequate to the expression that I made, meaning that it pushed you out of sovereignty. And now secondarily, your sovereignty is reduced by the state that you're in. So then what ends up happening is Evie and I would then ideally have a perception to recognize that happened, have a set of heuristics and actions to be able to hold, and either help you process through that and get you back into sovereignty so our communion has integrity, or recognize that that's just not going to happen. And so we would just sort of step back and wait until it can kind of come back into integrity as a group.